I like your background, all those books.
Thank you. Yeah, they're actually real. I have to go reach back and pull one off to prove that it's real. Welcome to Highlighter Live. For those of you who are new to the series, Highlighter is a place on the web for people to gather and read and discuss books. And we're running this town hall series as a way to bring authors into the mix so that we can all learn directly from the author and hear from her thoughts. Just FYI, we're recording the session and we're streaming it live to YouTube. So everything that happens here is on the record, and we're producing a nice video afterwards so you can kind of get a flavor of the highlights and understand some of the thinking that happened here and some of the learning, even if people couldn't attend. So we're excited to welcome Sarah Frier. Sarah has been a journalist with Bloomberg for almost a decade and has reported deeply on Facebook, Instagram, and other mega platforms and their implications on our lives, culture, and politics. Her book, No Filter, which came out in April, chronicles the inside story behind Instagram's founding, acquisition, and future within Facebook. So Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I wanted to also give a big thanks to my friend James Cham. James is an early stage investor at Bloomberg Beta, and as well, he's a fellow book lover, and he was instrumental in providing the connection to Sarah. So we have him to thank for tonight's event too.
James is wonderful.
He's great. He's deep in the books. Everything I've been to his physical in-person book events, and they're always fantastic. He does such a great curation. And so tonight for Process, Mishti is producing the show, and I want to turn it over to Mishti. I think you may have met her before, but I want to turn it over to her to share a bit about the format and how you can get involved.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. This is really exciting. Glad, Sarah, you could join us. So I guess what we just want to emphasize about the format is that you've all probably been to dozens of fireside chats in this new COVID Zoom era that we've been living for a couple months, but this is not that. This is not a fireside chat. We really want it to be an interactive town hall and have as many people kind of jump in with their own questions and ideas alongside Sarah as possible. So DK is going to kick off the discussion, but please feel free to chime in, and you can just post questions on chat or even directly message me and I'll get you right into the conversation. So thanks.
Sounds good. All right, so we'll get this party started. So Sarah, to start, we were already talking a little bit about kind of the writing process and the audiobook production, but I think the writing process is always something that I'm super curious to hear more about. And we'd love to hear a little bit about the origin story for the book. So what was the first moment you knew that you had this story to tell, and how did you get from there to No Filter that we have today?
Well, it started with the 2016 presidential election, because prior to that, I've been covering social media since Facebook's IPO. And prior to that, we're, as reporters, really thinking about it as a business story. Is Facebook going to meet its expectations for growing mobile advertising revenue? Are they going to figure out how to compete with Google on this product? Are they going to figure out how to compete with Twitter on that product? And the 2016 presidential election really taught all of us, including me, that the societal impact of these companies is going to be an even bigger story, and even more important, as these companies become more powerful, they become part of the infrastructure of our society. And they are so infused in our everyday activity and affecting the way that we learn new information and talk with each other and absorb our different realities and our shared realities. And I think that was really a wake-up call for me, because I've been poking around on some misinformation things, but I was more focused as a business reporter on, like, is Twitter going to sell to Disney, or is this or that going to help them compete? Is the CEO going to have, who's going to be the new CEO of Twitter? I remember that was a really big story in 2015. So I decided I needed to start thinking, what's the next big part of my coverage area, the social media beat, that people aren't thinking about now? But, if I could be in 2014 thinking about what's going to happen in 2016, what would I start asking questions about And Instagram, to me, was just such uncharted territory for business reporting. We knew the story of what was happening on Instagram, who was becoming famous there, what was changing in our culture. But for the most part, from a company perspective, we just thought of Instagram as a very successful acquisition by Facebook, operating harmoniously within the larger organization. And I hadn't asked those questions. So I devoted myself to asking those questions for a Business Week cover story that published in 2018, incidentally, the same week that Mark Zuckerberg was testifying about Cambridge Analytica and Russian election interference. And people were really fascinated by that cover story. I really wasn't sure what kind of a reaction I would get, but I tried to explore how Instagram was growing differently within Facebook. And then I realized that there were so many more questions I wanted to ask. And I'd been thinking about doing a book on Facebook. But after seeing the interest and the reaction to that story, I realized that there was so much more to dig into, a whole book's worth. It wasn't enough to just add it to my beat. I really wanted to know not just what happened, but how it happened and the different motivations of the people involved in the process. And it was pretty funny because as I was starting to report on this, right after I got the book deal, I started digging, started talking to former employees, and it started to become clear to me that there was a lot of tension brewing at Instagram with Zuckerberg, a lot of decisions that were rankling Instagram's leaders. And I started to think, like, what would happen if, what if they're going to leave? And sure enough, a month later, the founders left the company.
Right.
And then my book got a whole lot more interesting.
Right. Yeah. So it almost could have been, more business as usual, and then it happened to create a moment around the idea of who these people are and where the tension is. So how did you actually go about, I guess through your reporting, you had already built a lot of relationships with some of these players. Was that a particularly kind of crafted or challenging thing you needed to do once you decided to write the book, to be able to build enough relationship to build trust that you could actually get some of the real details?
It's so daunting because if you're trying to write the definitive story on something, you really want it to be true, and you really want to make sure you get all the perspectives you need. And especially with a company like Facebook, which, makes you sign an NDA the second you walk in the door, even if you're just visiting for lunch, it's so difficult to get people there to talk. But I just focused on reaching out to as many folks as I could. And there's a lot of triangulation as a reporter. Like once you talk to one person, you reach out to somebody else and say, hey, I heard this, but maybe if this is true, if I have all the context here, or if there's more to it. Because there's no way for any one employee within these organizations to see the whole thing, not even the CEO. It's really a process of digging deeper and talking to all the stakeholders. And with this particular book, I didn't want it to just be an internal business story, boardroom drama. I also wanted to think of the users of Instagram, of the people who became famous on Instagram, of all the other levels of how Instagram has affected our economy, how it's affected youth mental health. And so I wanted to talk to people more broadly, people even that I maybe had never had a chance to reach out to in my reporting in the past, like Kris Jenner, for example, would have no reason to comment on Facebook stories usually, but she was interested in talking for this book. So it was a journey. I tried to talk to at least one person every day and reach out to at least 5 people every day.
And did you have some people who would be quite guarded and other people who were like tripping over themselves to share more details, or how did that look?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, like some people felt a lot more comfortable with the idea of sharing, especially on background, but other people still to this day won't talk to me. Some people who I thought would be really key to my story, like some early employees who I thought would be really interested in talking. I talked with most of the early employees of Instagram, but others said, that chapter of my life is behind me. I'm not interested in revisiting it. It was a huge obsessive thing in my life, and now there's some pain about how it's turned out, and so I have no interest in being a part of this.
Yeah, I think all of those details like really came through. A lot of people were commenting on how you have these crazy anecdotes where you literally say like the announcement of the acquisition was made and these people made eye contact and like this person grabbed this person's leg, and
Right.
that level of detail was really surprising to me, that you were able to get access to like these extremely intimate moments. And like, was that a lot of the triangulation you're talking about, or was it just...
Yeah, exactly. Like, you ask one person, oh, this person remembers that they whispered this to you, and like, oh yeah, I remember. Like, I think it's very hard as a reporter. It's very hard for somebody to just offer those things up when you ask. Like, if I asked you, tell me about this really vivid moment of your life, what do you remember? Maybe you would have a good memory, but usually you need someone else to remind you. And people who say like, oh, I can't really recall any specific details. I just remember it was really crazy. And then you say, oh, well, so-and-so told me that you grabbed her leg, or whatever it might be. I don't want to give away who spoke. But then they're, oh my gosh, you're right. And then I remember that so-and-so went to the window, and then you can just kind of, that's what I mean by triangulation. You can bounce other people's memories off each other. And that's why I explain in the author's note in the beginning of the book that this book really is a compilation of memories, and memories warp and fade over time. They're altered by the photos we take. I remember things from my childhood, but then I try to think, am I just remembering the photo of them or the story of them? You sort of second guess yourself. And I think a lot of reporting is trying to connect the dots of those things, and then also back it up as much as you can with text messages, documents, emails, things that were announced, when they were announced, and putting it all together.
Yeah. And Jeff, do you want to jump in? Jeff had an interesting question about post-publication too.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, with all these really vivid anecdotes that you put forth in the book, like, have you gotten any pushback after the fact from like either people you interviewed or even other employees of Instagram or Facebook who were like, wait, this isn't the way it happened, or this doesn't sound right?
So really only a couple instances, and one I will tell you is pretty funny. Taylor Swift takes all her own cat photos. There is a very small line in my book about an Instagram employee helping her take pictures of her cat. Taylor took those herself.
Oh my gosh.
Wait, so did Taylor Swift actually like reach out to you and say this is wrong? Or to, like,
someone on her team.
Okay.
Between us, yeah. I know this is public, but
that's funny.
But yeah, the little details. But then that's, somebody remembered it a certain way, and I couldn't get to her before the book was published. So some things will end up being revised, but yeah, I think it's an interesting thing to turn what everyone knows and what everyone's written into a definitive history, and I know that that's a really big responsibility.
Are there other areas, like when the book finally came out, were there things that surprised you about how it was received, either positive or negative? It sounds like there weren't too many things that were maybe disagreed, except for the Taylor Swift's cat incident. But were there areas that people focused on that you didn't expect to be such a focal point?
Totally. I thought that most people would know the origin story of Instagram. In fact, I was really worried that people would read the first chapter and kind of know the high-level details already and not continue reading the book because they thought that it was, a repeat of stuff they already knew. When I tried very hard throughout the book to put a lot of stuff that people didn't know already. In fact, one of my bosses at Bloomberg, Brad Stone, who wrote The Everything Store, and several other great books, he told me that, like, to know that you're ready to write something, you need to have 100 things that nobody has ever read in your book. And so I was really careful about that. And so I was very worried about this chapter, but everyone kept, screenshotting or messaging me about the first chapter, because I think for a lot of people, they don't realize how interconnected Silicon Valley is. Just putting it all in one place, the idea that like Mark Zuckerberg and Kevin Systrom and Jack Dorsey and Travis Kalanick and all these people were just part of the same social scene and going to the same cafes at the same time, and it blew a lot of people's minds. I thought people were going to be a lot more interested in the culture side of the story, or some of the like antitrust concerns. More on that in a couple of weeks when the CEOs have to testify in front of Congress on antitrust.
Right.
But I was kind of surprised that people just really love the origin story.
It's funny, the origin story. We were just reminiscing a little bit. I don't know if you know Ariel in the audience. He was a board member at Odeo before it became Twitter, and then he was also. I originally met him about 10 years ago or 12 years ago at Dolores Labs, with where social media exists and where all of the where Travis did his pitch and where Instagram got started.
Yeah.
So it is kind of in the water here in San Francisco. You just end up stumbling across these things if you hang out long enough.
It's nice to meet you.
Good to meet you. I actually was the very first occupant at Dogpatch Labs. So,
Wow.
And the original Dogpatch Labs
memories.
was in the Dogpatch district, not in that location. But yeah, it's interesting. I was reading the early part and the reference. I was more familiar with the audio part of the story, having been on the board. And there's some of the things that you mentioned there that are considered. I think most people believe it's the way it happened, which didn't really happen that way. So I thought it was interesting. I was curious to what extent you when you if you get a few point of view and you're, like you say, it's memories, they fade. At the end of the day, you just do the best you can, and if it's not the way it happened, that's the way it is, and that's what you have to do, right?
I think you have to make some difficult choices, and you have to think about the agenda of the people who are talking to you and what they're trying to get out of it, because everyone's, as you've probably learned from my book, everyone's always trying to figure out, what is my legacy? How do I succeed in Silicon Valley? And a lot of that comes into the reporting process too. Like, people will say the version of events that makes them look better. And so I think it's just it's a numbers game sometimes, like getting enough people to say the same thing. But other times it's when you have those really vivid anecdotes, if they're from one person and maybe nobody else remembers them exactly, other people will often, if they are accurate, say something that it's like, well, that directionally makes sense. Like, that is something that I could see that happening in this context. Like, and then you can feel a little bit more confident writing it, even if you don't have as much documentation. But there were some things in the book that I wasn't sure who to believe. The instance around the fire pit at the Allen & Co. company conference, where Twitter sources say they handed the term sheet to Kevin Systrom and he handed it back, and Instagram sources say Kevin never got a term sheet. It's a he said. It's not something that you can you don't have video evidence of that happening in either direction. So in that instance, I just put both versions of the story in and explain the consequences of the debate.
Yeah, and you probably don't want to be too accurate, because reality is usually more boring than some of the interpretations, which is why I think some of these stories come up, because most founders don't want to say, oh, I got really lucky and this just took off. You want to come up with a story. But no, I enjoyed it.
I don't think I think that actually people trend towards telling you the boring things. And it's not until you talk to the employees of a company that you understand the things that maybe the people at the top didn't see, or or the things that they missed. And I also think that the reality of everyone working anywhere is that most of your day is just work, right? The story comes in the turning points. And so I think that's a lot of why people will say these pieces are dramatized, but I really think it's just, you're pointing out the points of decision making and impact, and what happens as a result of those decisions.
Right, instead of the 30 customer service emails that you did before lunch.
Yeah, exactly.
Doesn't always.
I wrote 40 lines of code. That wouldn't.
Right.
That wouldn't really be revelatory to people, because that's what they expect.
Right.
Yeah.
Some highlights.
I'd be interested to hear, Sarah, did you like find that in your actual interviewing of people and stuff for this book, that you got some of like the juicier details from employees rather than people higher up, if you can say without revealing too much about your sources?
I think the most important thing in reporting, I don't think that anyone talks to a journalist thinking that they're saying anything juicy necessarily. Like the biggest misconception about journalists is that people call you up and just, are anonymous and have a tip for you. Like, maybe my job would be a lot easier if that was what really happened, but journalism is about building trust with people and trying to understand the full context of their experience. And that comes through long conversations, not, fly-by calls. It comes from multiple conversations. Some of the best anecdotes in my book came from moments where I was struggling with trying to finish a chapter or understand a question that, like, even though I talked with dozens of people about it, I still couldn't quite figure out, like, what was the main turning point, what was the decision, and then calling people back and saying, I just need you to walk me through this one more time. Here's what I have heard so far. Like, what am I missing? Where am I falling short in my analysis? Or is this interpretation of events something that you think is fair? Or would you think that, like, maybe I'm putting too much weight on this? So it's really just about having a sounding board and that trust with people where they can say, I really think that you're off there, or oh yeah, no, I think that you would be safe if you wrote that. I think that's more how it works than the kind of salacious tip dropping and people wanting to damage their employer's reputation, which part of me feels like that gets taught a lot to people in technology, because companies are rightfully scared about being able to control the information that gets out, because you don't want to ruin the surprise for customers. You don't want to ruin the perception of your brand. And Facebook employees really didn't start speaking out publicly about their company while still employed until, like, I don't know, a few weeks ago. Like the walkout by Facebook employees over racial injustice and the handling of Trump's tweets. Trump's Facebook posts. I think that was one of the first times that current employees ever felt comfortable speaking out publicly about something they disliked that their employer was doing.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to dig into that a little bit more, because obviously No Filter was published in April, but I feel like a lot has even happened since then, particularly in the context of Facebook and its role in civic life. And so, like, a couple notable issues, obviously, that keep coming up are how they are treating political speech, and then also how they are running kind of platform advertising policies. So I'm curious, just to start on that, like, are there areas that you would dig deeper on if you were updating the book today, or are, like, really thinking about in that realm?
I think this is a story that's not over, right? That's what we're learning right now. Like, the usage of Instagram has changed so dramatically since the advent of COVID. It has become a lot more of a political place. It's become a lot more focused on messaging. It's become a lot more like Facebook too. And that's something that I hinted at would come in my book, that Instagram would start to have more notifications, more recommendation algorithms as opposed to curation, and more linkages with Facebook itself, and redirection of its users to go to Facebook. But I think we're really seeing that in full swing. I think the one thing I want to dig into, or maybe I should have dug into more from the Instagram side. I talk a lot in the end of my book about the AI handling of content and how Instagram is under-resourced compared to Facebook, and has not invested as much in the modeling that is Instagram specific. Like, they can borrow a lot of Facebook resources to look into Instagram's issues, but when it comes to the things that are unique to Instagram, like the anonymity, the meme culture, the hashtag culture, all of this stuff, I also think I should have dug more into the reality of building your career on Instagram and being beholden to the AI deciding to ban your account or take it down. Or I talked a lot about the idea that people would just randomly get promoted on Instagram because of the company's decision that their content was worth seeing. I didn't talk as much about the other side of that, which is people who build their livelihoods on Instagram only to have their accounts caught up in some problem and then have no recourse.
Yeah, totally. Another kind of common thread when you were talking about kind of these platforms and their role in people's cultural and political lives, I thought that was really interesting, was the extent to which kind of like the psychology and paranoia of one single individual Zuckerberg in this case had so many cascading effects. And I was kind of curious if you figured out, like, from talking to other employees, how do you most effectively deal with the psychology of a leader like that? Like, what have the most successful executives at Facebook figured out in terms of how to push back on someone like Zuckerberg, or how to change some of these platform policies that people are starting to sort of question and organize against? So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that when people try to convince Zuckerberg of something, they always go to the data. They always try to show him that the decision will lead to growth, or the decision will lead to more engagement, or the decision will not have the effect he's worried about. In fact, it has a different effect. And I think that he is very attuned to that. Like, he can be swayed by data. He can also be swayed by what other companies are doing. And you see that in my book as well. Like, if he sees Snapchat really successful at something, or TikTok really successful at something, again, you can see it from the app usage and the human behavior. He's really willing to try anything. And I think that people within Facebook, there's a lot of stark competition at the top of that company to try to have a lot of control over different products and build their next career step. But I think that Zuckerberg, when people want to communicate with them, they try to put it in a frame of competition.
Yeah.
Is that pretty different than maybe across your other technology reporting or meeting other leaders? Do you feel like the kind of maniacal focus on data and growth is pretty different than other examples, or does that tend to be more common or kind of expected?
I think that is pretty endemic in the culture of Silicon Valley, maybe in part because of folks like Zuckerberg, but I don't think that all leaders think that way. In fact, I've had conversations with Evan Spiegel where, like, I'll say, "Oh my gosh, you did this app redesign and you're losing users, and do you regret it?" And he's like, "No, this is my creative vision. Like, I wanted the app to look like this, and here we are, and it makes sense for the future of how we engage with media, and eventually people believe in what I believe in. It's more of like
Mm-hmm.
a personal, creative, design focused decision. And there are a lot of leaders like that in Silicon Valley, where they have a way that they think that their product should evolve, and they take it in that direction, and hope that they're right. And so I think that Mark Zuckerberg does get criticized for not having that clear product vision. Like, what do you want Facebook to be? Or are you just looking at the analytics and trying to build it into what the future is going to hold? And then it gets really confusing for users. Like, are you a groups product? Are you an events product? Are you a newsfeed? Are you shifting into stories? Like, there's so much going on Facebook, but at the same time, that's Zuckerberg's winning strategy. Is he wants to try everything, and that has really worked for Facebook for a long time.
Right. Yeah, it almost seems like it's an extension of just how like his worldview sort of really shapes the way that platform works, whereas maybe Snap looks a lot different today because of kind of the way Spiegel addresses, kind of his view, his own internal kind of beliefs about it.
Right. He didn't believe in A/B testing for a long time.
Right. Yeah. One of the things that we had, a few of us were discussing in the pre-event highlights were around how certain platforms, it's typical for platforms to grow and focus on growth and sort of become more platform oriented and not as much kind of curation and content oriented. And that a lot of times if a platform works really well, the taste of the people building it is not really core to it. Whereas with Instagram, it seems like maybe one of the biggest or best examples where the taste of who gets featured in, Discover, Explore, really was it was like a cultural taste making point versus what the data would say. So was that itself kind of really core to the conflict, the kind of data versus taste? Is that a reasonable framing?
It was absolutely core to the conflict between Facebook and Instagram. And Instagram saw a lot of value in having relationships with its biggest users, in curating content, and trying to figure out what kind of example to set for content. Whereas Facebook was much more thinking about itself like a platform. Like, you don't really want to be the people who say whether what you post is good or bad or healthy or unhealthy. We just want more.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that was a conflict at the heart of it. And I think that to your point, at scale, it becomes even harder to have taste.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of a trade-off. Like, do you want to be the cool niche community, or do you want to be the world-changing app that everyone uses? And at a certain point, even if you have paid such close attention to the users that you want to model for others, or the celebrities, or whatever it might be, at a certain point, you need more people on your team in order to keep track of what's happening. And the ratio of Instagram employees to Instagram users just makes that completely impossible. And so for as much as Instagram is invested in community building, I've talked with people with millions of followers in other countries who cannot get an Instagram employee on the phone because it's just so big now. And so many people have millions of followers.
Is there any other technology platform that has kind of similar taste and scale, or is it just sort of like a law of gravity that these things have to become more, I guess, platform-like and devoid of any particular taste?
Well, I think that you are seeing a lot more interpretations of what taste means, right? Like TikTok, for example, tailored its algorithm to show you things that make you happy. And in that way, not really talk about politics or injustice, and now that's starting to change in the US. I don't know if you guys saw the whole interesting an example of the teens on TikTok trying to buy up tickets to Trump's rally, or I should say sign up for Trump's rally and then deciding not to go. So we're seeing the culture change a little bit. But TikTok initially was like, we want to be escapist. We want to be the ultimate distraction. So that's like a way of curating that's not as much about choice. But then TikTok does have very close relationships with some of its biggest stars and actually helps them directly connect with advertisers to do campaigns. Yep. So that's one. And then Snapchat actually has a entire content strategy where they're actually helping make content and making their own shows and doing a higher standard of things. Like I don't want to say now it's a lot more algorithmic, but when it started, it was a lot more about tastemaking. And so I think that some people are taking, or some of these apps are taking a page out of Instagram strategy and trying to set a tone.
Yeah. I want to hand it to Anju. I think she had a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi.
Okay. Hi. So I was just wondering, I mean, being an avid Facebook user, how should people like us apply the pressure on platforms like Facebook to be more civically minded? For example, like how should we react to the civil rights audit? There is a lot of pressure on everyone. So what are your suggestions?
Well, I think that it's going to be very hard for an individual to be heard by Facebook, but I think a lot of individuals making a statement does make a difference. And we saw that with the recent ad boycott from big brands and Facebook having to try to appeal to them, but not getting very far. I think they'll have to do a lot more. I think that as users, the thing that will empower you, I hope, from reading No Filter and other kinds of reporting like this, is that you will understand the mechanisms behind the experience you're getting, the way that it's been tailored to you, the way that people are incentivized to share, to go viral, how Facebook is leaning more on groups now for growth because your friend circle is tapped out of people you actually know in real life. So they need you to use groups in order to expand that friend circle and increase your connections. Like there are all these little things, like once you understand the psychology behind the product's leaders, you can understand why you're getting certain notifications and how it fits into the bigger picture. And then you as a user can make decisions about how you want to use the product in a way that serves you, maybe not in a way as much that serves Facebook. And you can, I've experimented sometimes with changing the order of my timeline back to chronological just to see what happens. Or I've experimented with looking people up that I thought I should have in my feed, but that I don't. Or, just trying to play around with it a little bit. And I think that one of the hardest things on Facebook right now as a user is to see people who get sucked into conspiracy theory or get sucked into discussions about politics that are just full of vitriol and like people aren't really getting anywhere with them. And I don't weigh into a lot of that, but I do think that it's important to know as a Facebook user that an article from a reputable news source looks just the same as an article from a non-reputable one, and one that's trying to grab your attention, and that there's a difference between sponsored content and not. Just being equipped with all of those tools in your toolbox, you can help your family members and friends understand how their behavior is being shaped.
Right.
Yeah, understanding the context for how the platform is making the decision helps you understand if it aligns with your goals or if it's sort of in competition with your own personal goals and your values. So it's nice to be able to get some insight into that.
Yeah.
I wanted to invite Anna up. I think Anna has a question about influencers and tastemakers.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, thanks so much, Sarah. I actually listened to your book, so really enjoyed the narration. But during the course of your reporting, you talked to a lot of different influencers and tastemakers, and some of that reporting was looking backwards on trends that had shaped the platform in its early days. But towards the end of the book, you also talked a little bit about some of the things that were worrying some of these tastemakers. For instance, I think you described, it might have been Ariana Grande, but there were some pop stars who had young fans who were being bullied on the platform, and they kind of felt like Instagram wasn't meeting their needs to like fully take action on this. And so I was curious, in the course of talking to these other folks, did they have any asks that weren't being met by Instagram, or did you sense any trends in what these creators and these influencers wanted to see from platforms moving forward? Like, were there any major shifts in the way they wanted to connect with their audience that they weren't being able to do?
I think one of the biggest issues for people with the highest profile, highest following accounts is always bullying and spam like that, or getting their accounts hacked, honestly. But I think when you're thinking about like what's happening to their users, there are a lot of celebrities on Instagram who constantly have their likeness imitated by others for the purposes of scamming their fans. And that's really hard for them and for their fans. People, this is similar to what we saw today on Twitter, right? Somebody you really respect says, hey, like, you know, if you participate in this, I'll give you $50, or I'll pay X amount if you, you know, sign up for this or buy this product. And it's not actually the person. So I think that's really harmful, and really hasn't been addressed. In fact, I think there are still a few fake Mark Zuckerberg accounts lurking around Instagram and Facebook. And the bullying is still really difficult. It's just very harsh, taking advantage of the fact that these people have a big audience. But of course, that's the same thing that happens with everyday users. They just see it in a much higher volume. So no, I don't think these problems are completely solved. And I think Instagram tries to sometimes address on a case-by-case basis, or sometimes address the broader trends through like broad user education, or trying to algorithmically boost certain kinds of comments. But I don't think that the overall, they don't want to take down content unless it violates the terms of service. I've also seen a lot of concern about at least right now, one thing I've been hearing a lot is concerns about the wellness community on Instagram. And in time of COVID, like it's not necessarily that they're saying, you know, you should, some of them are, but most of them aren't saying like you should drink bleach to cure coronavirus. So that's the example Mark Zuckerberg always uses when he talks about harmful misinformation on Facebook and Instagram. But a lot of them are touting products of ill repute to their users that are supposed to enhance your immunity or may help protect you against COVID, which is not actually proven. So I think that kind of thing has been very concerning in the medical community right now with those high profile accounts. And I'm not sure, I actually just asked Facebook today about this, you know, where they draw the line between, you know, an opinion in terms of wellness advice or theories and something that could actually be harmful to somebody who's trying to manage their health.
Did you get any answer from them on that question?
Not yet. But Mark Zuckerberg is interviewing Dr. Fauci tomorrow, so maybe they'll have a chat about it.
Wow, I'll have to stay tuned for that. I was also curious, actually, on the topic of influencers. You wrote extensively, obviously, about influencers being able to make a living off of Instagram. And I'm wondering how you kind of see that changing into the future, because you have creators monetizing off of other viral platforms. You touched on TikTok. But then there's also people who are using subscription models and going on Substack or using Patreon and kind of not even engaging with some of these platforms that are fueled by ads and all of the negative things that go with that. So how do you see that evolving into the future?
Well, first of all, the entire advertising industry is disrupted right now. I mean, it's a hard time to sell a product for good reason, and you can't really, if you're a travel influencer and you've sold the idea of going on vacation for, maybe you've done that for 3 to 5 years of your life during the entirety of Instagram's rise. And that's just what you do is your career. And now coronavirus hits, and like, what do you do with yourself? So many influencers and creators are having to completely reinvent what they're about. And I've seen a lot of creativity, people who are doing live tutorials, doing subscription things, a lot of Patreon, a lot of podcasts that are subscription based, but also just a lot of live video on Instagram. And Instagram has recognized the shift, the fact that people aren't getting their regular revenue from advertisers, or at least aren't being paid the rates they used to be paid to hawk products, are now having these new avenues from Instagram to take tips during live videos or to revenue share on their Instagram TV videos. And that was really necessary, because for a while, Instagram was like the biggest game in town for influencers, but influencers can now be on TikTok. And so they need to be able to give influencers a way to make money that's not just dependent on the advertising industry. I've also seen a lot of influencers build their own brands detached from dependency on partners and advertisers. People who are trying to figure out like what they want to sell, their own clothing lines, their own merchandise. And that can be a sketchy thing too, because a lot of smaller companies have cropped up to help them do that, and they don't always see the products that they're selling. And it can be a great revenue stream, but it can also be quite risky.
Thank you for that. I want to actually call up George Zhang to chat with us. I know that he's a friend who actually used to work at Facebook and has worked in the travel industry online. So he probably has some relevant comments to discuss
Great.
or ask here.
Yeah, I guess my biggest question for you, first of all, Sarah, thank you for taking the time to chat. Really, really appreciate your perspective. One like big change and announcement, obviously Instagram did, was essentially announcing Shop on Instagram.
Yes.
And that's super interesting because, shifting from a platform focused on maintaining user attention and monetizing through ads to actually selling stuff, although it might seem just like a slight shift down the purchase funnel, can actually be a humongous change in monetization business model. So I'm kind of curious to get your perspective on that, and if anything popped up in that realm through the course of your research and reporting.
Yes. So I've actually dug a lot into Instagram Shop. I was planning on doing a big piece on it, and then COVID hit, and I think that it's just a different world for e-commerce than it was before. But I think that it's so interesting, because it's one thing for when you're scrolling on Instagram for this kind of salesy attitude to be subtle and packaged to you as part of a general aspirational lifestyle, maybe not even with disclosure of the fact that you're being sold to. You just see these images and the brand is tagged, and that's it. With Shop, it makes it a lot more overt. And one thing that Instagram pays attention to is like its ad load. So how many ads people are being served compared to their regular posts. And if people are served too many commercial things, then they may be turned off from Instagram and not feel like they want to hang out there. So there really has to be a balance if you go into Shop, first of all. Second of all, it is a huge opportunity. Like, this is probably the biggest opportunity for Facebook since advertising. The only big stream of revenue I can see for the company that has the potential to be quite significant is Shop on Instagram. beyond their normal business model. And so I think that they're going to take it slow and try to get it right. But I think it's going to be very difficult because there's such a variety of people who are trying to sell things on Instagram, may not all be high quality, verifiable products. And if users have a bad experience, is that something they'll blame Instagram for? And or is it something that where people sort of get it and they understand that they have a direct relationship with the seller? I also think Instagram's going to have to really boost its customer service, because if people are running their businesses through Instagram, it's a completely different ballgame than simply building a highly followed account there. So they're starting slow, but I think it'll be quite significant for the future of the company.
Great, thank you.
Great, thanks for the question, George. And then we're gonna wrap up soon, because I know we're hitting the 1 hour mark. We want to give everybody the rest of their evenings back, but we wanted to go to one other question from a community member, and then we'll have a final wrap up. So next up, we're inviting Anup Gosavi. Anup, are you there? Yeah, welcome.
Yeah, hi. Yeah. Thank you for this. So my question is, how did the Instagram founders kind of ease into their roles as executives, right? Both from just in terms of scaling personally, of managing a larger team and the growth pressures, as well as managing Zuck and the larger or the executive teams at Facebook.
I think one of the important things about these founders is that they had each other, which is, it's kind of a sappy thing to say, but they have a really good relationship, Kevin Systrom and Mike Krieger, unlike ones that I've seen at other tech companies at the top. And so I think in the early days, a lot of their growth was simply talking to each other and trying to figure out problems. But I think later on, Kevin Systrom especially became very interested in finding mentors to help him. And he would read a ton of books about management science. He would assign a lot of them to his top managers and say, okay, this month we're reading Peter Thiel, or this month we're reading Clayton Christensen. He would try to make sure that he absorbed all those lessons, then thought about how they would apply to the thinking at Instagram. And so I think that it's kind of similar to the way Instagram works, right? You are trying to surround yourself or fill your feed with people who you admire and look up to and want to be like. And that's sort of how he did he also had a management coach that he would regularly consult with. But he wasn't afraid to ask for advice. And one of his more recent mentors at the end of his tenure, one person I talked to through the book, but I don't think that I ended up using anything from that conversation, is Ray Dalio. And Ray Dalio was very instrumental in helping Kevin think about what comes next. Like if he leaves Instagram, because of the tension and because of feeling like he can't grow there, he shouldn't immediately take a new CEO job. He should take some time to think about who he is without Instagram and what he's good at without Instagram and what he's built personally in terms of skills, and then take a slow route back to the workforce and try a lot of things. So Kevin has obviously taken that advice and tried to be very thoughtful about what he's going to do next, but we haven't heard what that is yet.
Well, great. Well, I think that's a nice one to wrap on, because it kind of gives us some inspiration for the future to think about kind of what's next. And I think it's a question that we're all kind of constantly asking ourselves and trying to figure out what our next moves are with such a fast changing world. So this has been a real treat to have Sarah join us for all this great discussion. And as we're drawing to a close on the town hall, we'd like to conclude with a question we hope to ask to all of our featured guests. So Sarah, we want to turn the tables now and hear one of your questions for the world. So we've spent the evening asking you questions. We'd like to hear you ask us and the rest of the world, are there any topics, like what are you most curious about today? As a reporter, are there areas that you might want to probe or discussions that you'd like to be instigating next?
Oh my gosh. There's so many, honestly. But I think one of the really, just stepping back, one of the really big questions that comes out as we think about this social media world that we're building full of personalized lanes for consuming content, we all are going to end up with a different version of truth, reality. And so how do we as a society move forward without that collected sense of what is real? I think that's something that we're struggling with at so many levels, like with the election coming up, with coronavirus. People just have a very different idea of what the facts are, and that's because of their media diet and how personalized it is. So I would like to think about whether people have ideas for solving that.
Interesting. I love that. I think truth is something that we don't have a lot of great tools on the internet to verify and understand. So I think this is like a major unsolved problem, and it'll be a fun one to explore in the coming years. So thank you to Sarah. So thanks, Sarah, for joining us tonight.
Thanks, everyone.
And thanks to the whole Highlighter community for participating. The town hall wouldn't have been the same without the curiosity and energy that each person brought to it. So we really appreciate that. We've got a few announcements that we're going to make here about kind of some of the pre-wrap here, or the post-wrap. So we'll publish a newsletter summary of the discussion here we had tonight. It'll go on our blog, and then we'll also have a video. We're streaming the video, but we'll cut it up and produce something nice for it. And then we encourage anyone who hasn't yet bought Sarah's book to spread the word to friends. Mishti dropped the link to the Kindle in chat, so you can make the purchase right now if you haven't bought it yet. And then the next town hall we have scheduled is going to be with Nadia Egbal on August 4th. And it's the launch date for her new book, Working in Public, which will be a natural outgrowth of this conversation. And that link is going up in the chat next. Nadia is great, and we had sort of some scheduling conflicts. So if you heard her name before, her book got delayed a little bit, but we're gonna get it out on launch date on August 4th. So we'll see you back for that. And in the next week or two, we're going to be hosting a few prominent bloggers who've written some kind of deep thought pieces that we'd like to explore and understand and discuss a little bit more. So stay tuned. We'll be announcing those in some new open town hall sessions later this week. And if you have a favorite author who you'd like to see join us for a town hall, we'd love to hear your suggestions. So please do drop us a note. You can email us hello@highlighter.com. And thank you so much for jamming with us tonight. We'll see you next week for more energy, learning, and connection. And we'll see everybody online.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.